What if a teenager could conquer the world? It sounds impossible. A fantasy. The kind of story you'd find in myths, not in the pages of history. But this is no myth. This is the story of a boy who became a legend. A prince who became a god. A king who changed the world forever. This is the story of Alexander the Great. Long before Alexander crossed into Asia. Long before he shattered empires and built cities. He was just a boy. A boy with a dream that burned hotter than the sun. At just 16 years old, most young men are still finding themselves. Still learning who they are. But not Alexander. When his father, King Philip of Macedonia, marched off to war, he left his teenage son in charge of an entire kingdom. And the world was about to learn that Alexander was no ordinary prince. A rebellion broke out. Enemies thought the young regent would crumble under pressure. They were wrong. Alexander didn't hesitate. He gathered an army, crushed the uprising with ruthless efficiency, and to make sure no one ever doubted him again, he founded a city on the ruins of the rebellion. He named it Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that would bear his name. At 16, he had already proven something terrifying. He was born to rule. But how does a boy become a conqueror? How does a prince transform into a legend? The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in the classroom. Imagine being trained by the greatest mind in history. When Alexander was 13, his father hired the most famous philosopher in the world, Aristotle, for 3 years. In the quiet gardens of Mysa, the young prince sat at the feet of genius. He learned medicine, philosophy, biology, the nature of the stars. But most importantly, he learned how to think. Aristotle didn't just fill Alexander's head with facts. He taught him to question, to reason, to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. Alexander carried one book with him for the rest of his life. Homer's Iliad, the epic tale of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived. He kept it under his pillow, next to his dagger. He dreamed of glory, of immortality, of becoming a hero like those in the ancient poems. But Alexander didn't just want to match the legends. He wanted to surpass them. Aristotle shaped Alexander's mind, but it was his heart, his burning, restless heart, that would drive him to the edge of the known world. Not all wounds are visible, and not all scars are made by swords. A prince with a scarred heart and a burning dream. Alexander's childhood was not peaceful. His father, Philip, was a brilliant king and a ruthless warrior. But as a husband, he was a disaster. His mother, Olympias, was fierce, passionate, and jealous. Their marriage was a battlefield. Screaming matches echoed through the palace halls. Philip took other wives. Olympias plotted revenge. And young Alexander, caught in the middle, learned that power and love rarely lived in the same house. One night, during a drunken feast, Philip announced he was marrying again. A Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. The insult was too much. Olympia stormed out. Alexander stood, his face red with rage, and shouted at his father in front of the entire court. Philip, drunk and furious, drew his sword and lunged at his own son. But he was too drunk. He stumbled and fell flat on his face. Alexander looked down at him and said coldly, "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia. And he cannot even cross from one couch to another." Alexander and his mother fled into exile. 4 months. They lived in fear, cast out by the very king they loved. Eventually, Philip invited them back. But the damage was done. Alexander's heart had hardened. He learned that to survive, you must be stronger than everyone, even your own family. And deep inside, a dream took root. A dream that one day, he would unite the world. Not through violence alone, but through vision. He would create something his parents never could. Unity, loyalty, a legacy that would never crumble. But before Alexander could conquer nations, he had to conquer something far more dangerous: himself. He cried the day he tamed the wild horse no one could control. The horse's name was Bucephalus, meaning ox head. It was a massive black stallion, wild, untamable, violent. A trader brought it to King Philip's court, offering to sell it for an enormous price. But every rider who tried to mount the beast was thrown off, bucked, or kicked. Philip was furious. He told the trader to take the animal away. It was useless. But young Alexander, only 10 years old, stepped forward. "Father, you're losing a great horse because no one has the skill to handle him." Philip laughed. "And you think you can do better?" "Yes." Philip made a bet. If Alexander could tame the horse, it was his. If he failed, he would pay for it himself. Alexander approached the wild stallion slowly. He had noticed something the others hadn't. Bucephalus was afraid of his own shadow. Every time the horse saw it, he panicked. So Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, where the shadow disappeared. He spoke softly, stroked the animal's mane, and in one swift motion, mounted him. Bucephalus reared, kicked, but Alexander held on. He didn't fight the horse. He rode with him. And slowly, the stallion calmed. When Alexander returned, Philip had tears in his eyes. "My son, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." From that day forward, Bucephalus became Alexander's closest companion. They would ride together into every battle. Across deserts, mountains, rivers, a bond between man and beast that would become legend. But destiny doesn't wait for anyone. And sometimes, it arrives in blood, a kingdom in chaos, and a boy who seized it. In 336 BC, during the wedding of his daughter, King Philip was murdered, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, in front of a crowd. The killer was cut down immediately, but the damage was done. Macedonia was thrown into chaos. Philip's death left a power vacuum. Rivals circled like wolves. The empire he built was on the verge of collapse. Alexander was only 20 years old. Some believed he was too young, too inexperienced. Others whispered that he was involved in his father's murder, that his mother Olympias had orchestrated it. But Alexander didn't wait for accusations. He didn't wait for approval. He acted. Within days, he secured the loyalty of the army. He eliminated potential rivals, some through persuasion, others through execution. He moved so quickly, so decisively, that no one had time to challenge him. By the time the dust settled, Alexander was king, anointed by blood and by will. But Greece was not convinced. Many city-states saw Philip's death as an opportunity. They thought the young king would be weak. They were about to learn how wrong they were. They warned him. Persia is too big to defeat. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt to India, from the Mediterranean to the steppes of Central Asia. Millions of soldiers, endless wealth, a god king on the throne. To challenge Persia was to challenge the very order of the world. But Alexander smiled and marched straight at it. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He was the first to leap from his ship, thrusting his spear into the ground and declaring, "I accept Asia as a gift from the gods." His army, 40,000 men strong, followed. They had no idea they were about to change history forever. The first test came quickly. The battle that changed world history began with a trick. The Persian satraps, the governors of the western provinces, gathered their forces at the Granicus River. They lined up on the far bank, waiting for Alexander to cross. The river was fast, the bank steep, a perfect defensive position. Any army trying to cross would be slaughtered. Alexander's generals urged caution. "Wait until morning. Scout the area. Find another route." But Alexander had no patience for caution. He knew that hesitation was the enemy of victory. So he did the unthinkable. He ordered an immediate attack. The Macedonian cavalry plunged into the river, water spraying, horses struggling against the current. Persian arrows rained down. Men fell, but Alexander led from the front, charging up the muddy bank, sword flashing. His white-plumed helmet made him an easy target, and the Persians knew it. A noble named Rosesses rode straight at Alexander. His sword came down, smashing into Alexander's helmet, splitting it in two. Alexander's head rang, but he didn't fall. He thrust his spear into Rosesses' chest, driving him from his horse. Another Persian, Spithridates, raised his sword to strike Alexander from behind. But Clitus, one of Alexander's oldest friends, saw the danger. With one swing, he severed Spithridates' arm. The sword fell uselessly to the ground. Alexander had come within inches of death. But he didn't retreat. He pushed forward, and soon, the Macedonian phalanx, that unstoppable wall of spears, was across the river. The Persians broke. They fled. The first battle was won. But this was only the beginning. Alexander's march through Asia Minor was relentless. City after city fell. Some surrendered without a fight. Others resisted and were destroyed. He moved like a storm, fast, unpredictable, unstoppable. And then he came to Gordium, a moment that proved destiny is real. In the center of the city, inside an ancient temple, was a knot. Not just any knot. This was the Gordian knot, tied centuries earlier by King Gordius. Legend said that whoever could untie it would rule all of Asia. Many had tried. All had failed. The knot was impossibly complex, woven so tightly that no one could find where it began or ended. Alexander stood before it. His men watched, waiting. He studied the knot for a long moment. Then, without a word, he drew his sword and sliced it in half. Some gasped, others cheered, but Alexander simply walked away. He had just declared to the world that rules meant nothing to him. Destiny was not something you untangled. It was something you seized. News of Alexander's victories spread. And finally, the great king himself, Darius III, decided to act. A storm of arrows, dust, and fear. At Issus, in a narrow coastal plain, the two kings met. Alexander had 40,000 men. Darius had more than 100,000. The Persians stretched across the battlefield, a sea of soldiers, chariots, cavalry, and at the center, on a towering war chariot, stood Darius, draped in gold and purple, the living god of Persia. Alexander looked at the enemy, outnumbered, outflanked, surrounded, And he smiled. He formed his army into a wedge. The phalanx in the center, cavalry on the wings, and at the tip of the wedge, Alexander himself. He didn't give a long speech. He simply pointed his sword at Darius and shouted, "Follow me!" The Macedonians charged, not at the Persian flanks, not at their weakest point, straight at Darius himself. It was madness. It was brilliant. The Persians didn't expect it. Their lines buckled. Alexander smashed through, cutting his way toward the great king. Closer, closer. Darius saw him coming, saw the wild-eyed Macedonian king, covered in blood, unstoppable, and Darius ran. The moment the Persian soldiers saw their king flee, the battle was over. They broke. They scattered. Alexander had won, and Darius, the king of kings, had become a fugitive in his own empire. But Alexander wasn't done. He turned south, toward the cities of Phoenicia. He captured a city built on dreams. The island city of Tyre was considered impregnable, built on a rock, surrounded by water. Its walls towered above the sea. No army had ever taken it. But Alexander didn't care about impossibilities. If he couldn't reach the city by sea, he would build a bridge. For 7 months, his engineers labored, constructing a massive causeway from the mainland to the island. Stone by stone, mile by mile, the Tyrans fought back. They sent fire ships, destroying Alexander's siege towers. They poured boiling oil on his soldiers. But Alexander kept building. And when the causeway finally reached the walls, the Macedonians poured into the city. The battle was brutal. Thousands of Tyrans died. The survivors were sold into slavery. But Alexander had done the impossible. He had conquered the unconquerable. And the causeway he built? It still exists today. Tyre is no longer an island. It's part of the mainland. A permanent reminder of Alexander's will. From Tyre, Alexander marched into Egypt, a conqueror who bowed before a holy land. The Egyptians hated the Persians. For them, Alexander wasn't an invader. He was a liberator. They welcomed him with open arms. The priests of Memphis crowned him pharaoh. But Alexander wanted more than a crown. He wanted divine approval. So he journeyed into the desert, to the Oracle of Siwa, one of the holiest places in the ancient world. The journey was treacherous. His guides got lost in the sandstorm. But Alexander pressed on, driven by something deeper than ambition. When he finally reached the temple, the high priest greeted him and proclaimed him, "Son of Ammonius, son of a god." No one knows what Alexander truly believed. Was it propaganda? A political move to solidify his rule? Or did he truly believe that he was destined for something greater than any mortal? Whatever the truth, from that day forward, Alexander carried himself differently. He was no longer just a king. He was something more. Before leaving Egypt, he did something that would outlast every battle he ever fought. He created a city that still stands today, on the Mediterranean coast, where Africa meets the sea. Alexander traced the outline of a city in the sand. He envisioned it as a place where cultures would meet, where knowledge would flourish, where East and West would become one. He named it Alexandria. Today, more than 2,300 years later, Alexandria still stands, a living monument to a king who dreamed not just of conquest, but of legacy. But the war was far from over. Darius had regrouped, assembled a new army, and he was waiting. One man versus an empire of millions. At Gaugamela, in the plains of northern Iraq, Darius prepared his final stand. He had learned from his mistakes. This time, he chose open ground, perfect for his chariots and cavalry. He flattened the terrain, removed obstacles. He had war elephants, side chariots, soldiers from every corner of the empire. By some estimates, his army numbered over 200,000. Alexander had 47,000. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals were nervous. They urged him to attack at night, to use the cover of darkness. But Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory." At dawn, the two armies faced each other. Darius stood at the center, on his golden chariot, surrounded by his elite immortals. Alexander rode on Bucephalus, his battered helmet still dented from Granicus. The Persians attacked first. Chariots thundered forward, blades spinning from their wheels. But Alexander's men opened gaps in their lines, letting the chariots pass through harmlessly. Then, javelin throwers picked off the drivers. Alexander saw his moment. He saw a gap forming in the Persian line, and he charged, leading his companion cavalry. Alexander drove straight into the heart of the Persian army, heading directly for Darius. It was the same tactic he used at Issus, and once again, it worked. The Persian center collapsed. Darius, seeing Alexander cutting through his guards like a reaper through wheat, panicked, and once again, he fled. But this time, his own men turned on him. The night he became king of Asia, Darius was betrayed by his own satraps, led by a man named Bessus. They stabbed him, left him to die on the side of a road, like a common criminal. When Alexander found him, Darius was barely alive. Alexander covered him with his own cloak, and promised to hunt down his killers. Darius died in Alexander's arms, and Alexander, for all his ambition, wept. He gave Darius a royal funeral, honoring him as a king, not as an enemy. With Darius dead, Alexander was now the ruler of the Persian Empire, king of Asia, master of the known world. He entered Babylon like a god returning home, the greatest city on earth, with its towering walls and hanging gardens, opened its gates without a fight. The people lined the streets, throwing flowers, chanting his name. Alexander rode through, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He respected their temples, their customs. He even adopted Persian dress, blending Macedonian and Persian traditions. Some of his men grumbled. They didn't cross half the world to see their king dressed like the enemy. But Alexander had a vision. He wasn't just conquering the world, he was uniting it. Yet not every city welcomed him. Inside the palace of Persepolis, he faced his greatest temptation. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, a city of unimaginable wealth, gold, jewels, centuries of treasure. Alexander took it all. But then, during a drunken feast, someone suggested burning the palace as revenge. For when the Persians burned Athens 150 years earlier, Alexander, drunk and caught up in the moment, agreed. The palace was set ablaze. The flames could be seen for miles. And in the morning, when Alexander sobered up, he reportedly regretted it. But it was too late. The symbol of Persian power was ash. To this day, historians debate. Was it a calculated act of propaganda? Or a drunken mistake? Either way, it sent a message. The old world was gone. Alexander's world had begun. But one man refused to accept the new order. He chased a ghost across deserts and mountains. Bessus, the man who murdered Darius, declared himself the new king of Persia. He fled east, into the wild lands of Bactria and Sogdiana. hoping Alexander would never follow. He was wrong. For 2 years, Alexander pursued him, through mountains, deserts, frozen rivers. He would not rest until justice was served. Finally, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and handed over to Alexander. Alexander had him executed, not as a king, but as a traitor. His ears and nose were cut off, and he was sent back to Persia to face the families of those he betrayed. It was brutal, but in Alexander's mind, it was necessary. He had promised Darius, and he kept his word. But not everything in those eastern lands was violence. A love story born in war. In the fortress of Sogdian Rock, Alexander met a woman named Roxana. She was the daughter of a Bactrian noble, and by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful. Alexander, who had conquered cities and kings, fell in love. He married her, not for politics, not for strategy, but because, for once, he wanted something for himself. Their marriage was a symbol, Greek and Persian, united. It was controversial. Many Macedonians disapproved, but Alexander didn't care. Roxana would remain by his side, and later, she would bear him a son. But love couldn't stop the march. Alexander had one more frontier, India, the battle elephants that shook the earth. King Porus of India, a giant of a man, rode into battle on a massive war elephant. His army had 200 elephants, creatures the Greeks had never fought before. At the Battle of Hydaspes, Alexander faced his greatest tactical challenge. Elephants terrified horses. Their trumpeting shook the ground, and they could trample entire units. But Alexander adapted. He used his cavalry to isolate the elephants. Then his infantry attacked with javelins and axes, aiming for the legs, the eyes. The elephants panicked, turned, and stampeded back into their own lines. King Porus fought bravely, even wounded. He refused to flee. When Alexander finally captured him, he asked, "How should I treat you?" Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander was so impressed. He not only spared Porus, but let him keep his kingdom as an ally. But after Hydaspes, something changed. For the first time, his army said no. Alexander wanted to keep going, to cross the Ganges, to reach the edge of the world. But his men were exhausted. They had been marching for 10 years, fighting in deserts, mountains, jungles. They were tired, homesick, broken. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to go further. Alexander begged them. He argued. He pleaded. But they would not move. For 3 days, Alexander sulked in his tent, like Achilles in the Iliad. But finally, he accepted it. He built 12 massive altars, one for each god, as a monument to how far they had come. And then, he turned back. Alexander wept, not because he had failed, but because there were no more worlds to conquer. The journey home was hell, a march through hell itself. Alexander chose to return through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest places on earth. He did it to prove he could, to match the feats of ancient heroes. But it nearly destroyed him. For 60 days, his army marched through burning sands. No water, no shade. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Horses died by the hundreds. Soldiers abandoned their weapons, their armor, just to survive. One day, a group of scouts found a small trickle of water. They filled a helmet and brought it to Alexander. He looked at the water, then at his dying men, and poured it onto the sand. "If I cannot share it with all, I will share it with none." More men died in that desert than in all his battles combined. But even Alexander, the great uniters, could not escape the poison of power. He punished his own friends to protect his empire. Clitus, the man who saved Alexander's life at Granicus, had become bitter. He hated how Alexander dressed like a Persian, how he demanded to be treated like a god. One night, during a drunken argument, Clitus mocked Alexander, said he owed all his victories to his father, Philip. Alexander, drunk and enraged, grabbed a spear and killed him. The moment Clitus fell, Alexander realized what he had done. He collapsed, sobbing. He locked himself in his tent for days, refusing to eat, to speak. He had killed the man who saved his life, and the guilt haunted him forever. But Alexander pressed on. He dreamed of uniting every culture under one rule. In the city of Susa, he held a massive wedding. 10,000 Macedonian soldiers, married to Persian women, Greek and Persian, united in marriage. It was a grand vision, but many resented it. They saw it as betrayal. Alexander didn't care. He believed that the future belonged to those who could see beyond borders. But the cracks were showing. A king who began to look like the gods he claimed. Alexander now wore Persian robes. He demanded that visitors bow before him, Persian style. His Macedonian soldiers, who had fought beside him for years, were appalled. Was he still their king? Or had he become something else? Even his closest friends began to wonder if Alexander had lost himself in his own myth. And then, betrayal came from within. The night his best general rebelled, Harpalus, Alexander's treasurer, one of his oldest friends, fled to Greece with stolen gold. He tried to raise a rebellion. It failed. But the message was clear. Even those closest to Alexander were starting to doubt him. Still, Alexander kept planning. He planned an invasion no one talks about. Before his death, Alexander began preparing for a new campaign, the conquest of Arabia. He gathered ships, scouts, soldiers. He wanted to control the trade routes, to circle the known world. But fate had other plans. In June of 323 BC, the world shook when he fell sick. After a banquet in Babylon, Alexander developed a fever. At first, it seemed minor, but day by day, it grew worse. His generals stood by his bedside, watching helplessly as the greatest conqueror in history slowly faded. For 10 days, he burned with fever, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, his final words still spark mystery today. His generals asked him, "Who do you leave your kingdom to?" Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." And then, on June 10, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. His death split the world like broken glass. His generals, once brothers in arms, turned on each other. They fought for decades, carving his empire into pieces. The wars of the Diadochi would rage for 40 years. Macedonia, Egypt, Syria, Persia, all became separate kingdoms. Alexander's dream of unity shattered. And even in death, mystery followed him. A king without a tomb. Alexander's body was placed in a golden coffin and taken to Egypt. He was buried in Alexandria, the city he founded. But over the centuries, his tomb was lost. Earthquakes, wars, time erased it. To this day, no one knows where Alexander the Great rests. So who was Alexander? The boy who wanted to outshine Achilles, and succeeded. He carried Homer's Iliad everywhere. He slept with it under his pillow. He modeled his life after the heroes of myth, and he succeeded. Achilles was a legend, but Alexander was real. He risked his life more than any king before him. He fought at the front of every battle. He was wounded by arrows, swords, stones. Once, an arrow pierced his lung. His doctor said he would die, but he didn't. He led, not from safety, but from the front. He was the world's first globalist. 2,300 years ago, he built cities, spread Greek culture, encouraged trade between nations. He believed that humanity could be united, and though his empire crumbled, his ideas didn't. A vision too big for one lifetime. Alexander's dream of a single united world collapsed after his death, but it inspired Rome. It inspired the Byzantine Empire. It inspired every conqueror who came after. Even today, leaders speak of unity, of breaking down borders. Alexander, in a way, never stopped marching. He ruled by fear and by love. Some followed him because they admired him, because they believed in him, because they loved him. Others followed because they feared him more than death itself. The river that almost killed him. Once, while crossing a raging river, Alexander was swept away by the current. His men dove in, trying to save him. But Alexander shouted, "Save the others first!" He nearly drowned, but he refused help until every one of his soldiers was safe. The warrior who thought death was too slow. Alexander once said, "I would rather live a short life of glory than a long life of obscurity." He got his wish, a king who mourned like a child. When Bucephalus, his beloved horse, died, Alexander wept. He founded a city in his honor. Bucephala, even conquerors, have hearts. The general who never lost a single battle, from Greece to India. Alexander fought more than 20 major battles, and he won every single one. The man who became a legend before he became a king, long before Alexander ruled the world. He ruled himself. He conquered fear, doubt, hesitation. He believed that destiny was not something you waited for. It was something you seized, with courage, sharper than any sword. And so, the boy who dreamed of glory became the man who changed the world. Alexander the Great, king, conqueror, legend. His empire fell, but his name will never die.